Welcome to Investigating Versailles, where each week we'll take a closer look at the new show Versailles. The show transports us to 1667 and the court of King Louis XIV of France as he undertakes the building of his infamous palace.
This week we saw the very first episode where Louis first gets the idea to transform his father's hunting lodge into a grand palace and struggles to exert control over his ministers at court and his brother Philippe, all while carrying on various affairs with women at court, including his sister-in-law Henriette Anne and Louise de la Vallière. At the end of the episode, and perhaps the most shocking scene of all, we see Queen Marie-Thérèse give birth to a black baby, leaving everyone looking for answers.
This week, though, we're dissecting the role of science and medicine at the court. Throughout the episode, we saw medicine pop up again and again in various contexts. But what about these practices were really true to life at Louis's court? We're going to find out.
One sequence that really struck me was the bloodletting that was used to treat Louis's manservant's son when he was ill. Let's hear from Michael, our chief medical correspondent, for more detail on how common these practices really were and how accurate this depiction was.
Thanks, Katie and Elizabeth. During the reign of Louis XIV, bloodletting was an incredibly common practice. In fact, it is said Louis XIV was bled 5 times during his youth when he was treated for smallpox. At the time, it was thought that the body was composed of 4 humors: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. Disease was thus attributed to an imbalance of these humors. Bloodletting was employed in cases when it was thought the disease was caused by the presence of too much blood in the body. Another medical technology seen in the episode is the prosthetic arm, which Louis' gardener is briefly shown wearing. Interestingly, prosthetics have been in use since roughly 900 BCE in Egypt, where the earliest prosthetic, a wooden toe, was created. In the 16th century, French surgeon Ambroise Paré also made significant improvements to the amputation and prosthetic technology. Paré was the first to introduce a hinged prosthetic hand and leg. Paré's advancements mean that the gardener's prosthetic hand in the show really isn't all that difficult from what we'd expect of the time. 17th century medical marvels didn't stop here. Doctors at this time also began using medical thermometers and microscopes, which led to the observation of cells and microorganisms, as well as a better understanding of human anatomy and physiology. It's truly impressive how much 17th century physicians could do.
Wow, that's really interesting. Thank you, Michael. So, we also saw some really gruesome shots of dissection in this episode, and that seemed really advanced to me. Michael, can you tell us how true this depiction of scientific advances was to the time period?
So, during the reign of Louis XIV, it was actually very acceptable to perform animal dissections. In fact, Louis allowed Parisian scientists like Claude Perrault to dissect animals from the royal menagerie under Colbert's supervision. In fact, Louis himself attended the dissection of an elephant at Versailles in 1681. These scientists attempted to make connections between their discoveries in animals and human functions, but this was not always done correctly. These biologists were only a few of the many scientists employed in his Academy of Sciences, which also focused on subjects like astronomy. As for human dissection, France was actually a leader of sorts in accepting human dissection. Andreas Vesalius pioneered the subject in the 16th century at the University of Paris in defiance of the Catholic Church's condemnation of human dissection. So, during the age of Louis XIV, all forms of dissection were performed, sometimes even as a spectacle in front of crowds of onlookers, though there was often no reliable, official way of obtaining a human body. Often, murderers' bodies were authorized for dissection. So, I'd say that these dissections, particularly because they were being done clandestinely, were actually pretty realistic.
Thanks, Michael. And naturally, we can't discuss this episode and the medicine of the time without talking about the elephant in the room, the black baby that Louis's wife, Queen Marie-Thérèse, gives birth to. Now, historians differ on whether or not the queen actually gave birth to a black baby, and some speculate that she really did give birth to a child who was fathered by her African dwarf Nabo, who we also saw in the episode. This speculation is bolstered by the existence of a mixed-race French nun named Louise Marie-Thérèse, who would have been about the same age as the daughter that Marie-Thérèse gave birth to in 1664. Oddly, this nun, who is called the Mauresse de Moret, had her portrait painted by the same artist who completed various portraits of Louis. She also received a royal pension and spoke of her royal lineage, and she's mentioned in the memoirs of 6 individuals who lived at court at the time.
But other historians take a more medical approach to this question, arguing that the child the queen gave birth to in 1664 really did die shortly thereafter and was claimed to be black because it was discolored, really more of a purplish color, as a result of asphyxiation and other birth complications. But, I have to say, I was also struck by the conditions under which the queen gave birth, surrounded by members of court for one thing, and confined for the actual childbirth, as well as days before and after. This doesn't sound comfortable. Let's take a closer look.
We cannot afford not to.
He's coming.
Push now. Breathe. Good, Your Majesty, good.
Yes. Push, Majesty. Push.
Keep pushing.
Push.
Don't forget
Yes.
to breathe.
Thrust ahead.
Push now.
Push hard.
Almost.
Yes, Majesty.
Yes, Your Majesty.
Sire, please. Everyone must leave. At once.
Everyone must leave. At once. It's the king's words.
Well, what is the meaning of this? Doctor, what is the sex? Come, man, speak. Where is your tongue?
The problem is not the sex, sire. It's her colour.
Michael, can you talk to us about the accuracy of what we've just seen?
In this period, it was actually quite common for monarchs to give birth publicly. This was to ensure that the queen actually gave birth to the child who would be hailed as a royal child and that no substitutions occurred. Compared to this image of Louis XIII's birth, Marie-Thérèse really doesn't have many people watching her give birth. Confinement before the birth was also common, keeping noblewomen in bed for days before and often weeks after they gave birth. In the episode, we see that the physician attending the birth is nervous that the child will not be a boy, because boys were so heavily favored, and only they could be an heir. This is unsurprising, because although any royal birth was notable, daughters were considered a major disappointment. In fact, many superstitious practices existed to ensure the royal child would be a boy, including attempting to conceive under the waxing moon, eating meat, and physically constricting the left testicle, which was believed to generate female children. As we also saw in the episode, the royal physician would signal the child's gender to the king by saying, "I do not yet know about the gender if the child was a boy, and I do not know if the child was a girl." Some people claim that Louis XIV's fascination with childbirth and his desire to be able to observe unobstructed led to a change from the use of the birthing stool to the reclining position we see in the show. While Louis may have had some influence on this shift, the surgeon François Morisot is usually credited with introducing the change in position around the same time that Louis reigned. Though the doctor we see assisting with the birth in the episode seems to be a physician or a surgeon barber, Louis also mandated male midwives or accoucheurs attend royal births at the time.
Wow, that is fascinating. Now, since we are already speaking of childbirth, let's take a look at those two doctors who helped deliver the Queen's baby, specifically Claudine, the doctor's daughter. Now, there's a lot of tension between Claudine and her father about Claudine's pursuit of medical knowledge. She's engaging in dissections and autopsy and frustrated by the lack of progressive attitude towards medicine at the time. She seems like a pretty revolutionary figure here, but we as modern viewers might actually feel more comfortable with her as a character than we should.
That's right. Claudine references a lot of modern medical knowledge, but speaking honestly, her character is probably the most unrealistic in the show. While there were a few women practicing medicine at the time, Claudine's modern sensibilities are completely unbelievable. The medical knowledge she references would not be discovered for decades at the least.
This makes Claudine both really interesting and frustrating. For some, she might serve as an important role, reminding the viewer that we are immersing ourselves in a time period so different from our own. But at the same time, she amplifies the experience in a way and points out to the reader just how different the 17th century medical practices were from our modern perspective.
But in a lot of ways, too, her inaccuracy breaks the flow of the show. The viewer is pulled out of the time period and reminded of modern sensibilities that have no place at Versailles at this time. If we can't trust her to be accurate, her place in the show raises all kinds of questions about the authenticity of what's being shown from dissection to childbirth, which ultimately does the viewer and the show a disservice. Mm-hmm. So, with this in mind, and as we move forward in the show, keep an eye out for continued references to medical marvels or to potential inaccuracies of the time. But tune in next week for a whole new perspective on Versailles with an episode 2 of Investigating Versailles.